Thank you, Karen. Thank you, everybody, for showing up. This may be the largest audience I've ever played to. So tonight, I'm going to hopefully teach you something new about the Archaic period in St. Johns River Valley, maybe even archaic cultures in general, and maybe I'll even be a little entertaining, too. So to begin with, this is what Thornhill Lake looked like in the late 1880s. This is a watercolor painting by Winslow Homer, a very famous American watercolorist. He, along with Ulysses S. Grant and a few other ex-presidents, used to fish on the St. Johns River pretty regularly, including Thornhill Lake. And because of its prominence as a fishing spot, a lot of other people ended up there too. Jeffries Wyman and Clarence Moore. But we'll talk a little bit more about those fellas in a bit. Oh, this way? Uh-oh. Underneath. I'll tell you what. There we go. Now, most folks don't associate monumental architecture, like mortuary mounds, with hunter-gatherer societies. Nevertheless, hunter-gatherers have been constructing archaic mortuary mounds since about 6,500 years ago. The earliest, I believe, are in Louisiana, Watson Brake, Frenchman's Bend, several other sites. And until very recently, the mid-1990s, there wasn't really a whole lot of information about them. There were some radiocarbon dates, but they were believed to be anomalous. They were too early to be in mounds. But for the work of several individuals in Louisiana, most notably, as well as Mike Russo down along the southwest coast of Florida, it's been fairly well established with good archaeological research, good solid data, radiocarbon dates to support the ages of these mounds. So it seems that, indeed, archaic hunter-gatherers did build mounds. However, in the Louisiana case, they didn't have burials, or at least none that were able to be recognized. Now, Poverty Point has at least 2 cremation burials at the base of the big mound. And other than perhaps Tick Island, Harris Creek, and the St. Johns being a sort of precursor to the formal archaic mortuary mounds, Thornhill Lake stands as one of the best examples in the St. Johns River Valley. Now, hunter-gatherers, again, not thought of as being people who make mounds. We know them from the ethnographic record as folks who move around a lot, live in some pretty desolate environments, the Arctic, the Kalahari Desert, and other sort of marginal environments across the globe. They don't have a lot of material possessions, and what they do is pretty simple. They're thought of as being the simplest form of human society, the band level, hunter-gatherer, characterizing humanity since its earliest days. But they appear to be a little more complex than we once thought. Now, again, when you see monuments, you think big, massive, imposing structures. Mayan temples faced with stone. The very famous Stonehenge and the other Henge monuments of Europe. Hunter-gatherer mounds and monuments are a little different. They're a bit simpler, perhaps, easier to build. You didn't have to lug huge stones and set them vertical or build them high to the sky, but they did build mounds of earth and shell, but it's the ones made of earth that, at least for mortuary mounds, make the clearest case. There is some debate now whether or not shell monuments are mortuary facilities or, monuments at all. Some folks are still working that out. However, I feel Thornhill Lake is the best example of archaic period mortuary monumentality, at least in Florida and perhaps the southeastern US. So I have this interest in old stuff, and the way I came to Thornhill Lake was sort of through happenstance. I was at SEAC in 2001, and I bought that nice reissue volume of Clarence Moore's East Florida Expeditions. And I'm leafing through it, and all of a sudden I come to this plate of banner stones, and I was like, those seem a little out of place in a mound. Kind of curious, so I began looking into it. Got some permits to go on a state property, got a 1A32, started making some site visits, began doing a little detective work finding out where these artifacts are. And I found them. They're in the Smithsonian. Yikes. I wasn't expecting that to happen. Or that. Okay, so what I wanted, now I have to say this computer does have a nasty habit of changing the screen without me doing it. It does it all the time during lectures. A little comic relief here and again. All right, but what I want to know, my research question is, under what conditions did archaic mortuary monuments, why were they built? And what were the conditions for that along the Atlantic coast and the St. Johns River Valley? So what I did was design a program of excavation, topographic mapping, and subsequent collections analysis. I did travel to the Smithsonian and was able to see firsthand all the material culture that Clarence Moore, well, I shouldn't say all the material culture, most of the material culture Clarence Moore excavated from the mounds. There are some things that have gone missing, and nobody seems to know where they are. Perhaps they were given as gifts to people in the past, and we don't know where they are now. All right. Now, a lot of the emphasis on archaic mounds has been, or at least the ones made of shell, are they food remains or are they monuments? That's a fair question, and one that I'll let other folks hash out. Mine, in my mind, are more clearly monuments than they are food remains. And in hunter-gatherer studies, there seems to be an emphasis on diet and technology. And one of my approaches to understanding why people built these things, what were the conditions for constructing mortuary monuments, took a more social approach, a more symbolic approach. And one aspect of that is remembering. Everybody here remembers, I hope, perhaps some better than others. Myself, I remember often, and I remember a lot. So what does it mean? It means to recall things to mind, to dwell upon the past in a certain sense. But how does it work? Well, sometimes things are spontaneously called to mind. Other times there are prompts, cues, perhaps, mnemonic devices. And to a large extent, there it goes again. All right. To a large extent, things can help us to remember. Why do we have a Vietnam War memorial? To remember the fallen soldiers of that war. Why do we have memorials in general? To remember, to create places, spaces for remembering. And just as an example, other than clear monuments are everyday things. I brought one with me today. I was listening to it today. A record. A 45. Well, actually, it's a 33, but it's size of a 45. It's one of my favorite bands. And I bought this back in 1994, prior to the start of my first semester at USF. I went down to, it's on Nebraska Avenue. There's a record store there, and me and my buddy Eric came down for a concert, and we're in there looking through the record store. I picked this up. We saw the bands drive by in their vans with their trailers heading to the place we're going to go see. And just by interacting with this, I was, in a sense, transported back to 1994. I was able to, through a series of connections between things, places, people, events, recall that. And this is going to be an important aspect of what I talk about tonight, is things and how they help people to remember. Now, memory operates at many, many levels. Individuals, families, communities, countries, continents. The scale of memory is as big as the social network, which can be, in today's age, global to a very, very literal extent. And memories help people to establish who they are. It helps to form identity. For example, we have a whole lot of historical narrative around the founding of our country. We have our, if you want to call them this, mythological ancestors, the founding fathers. We have touchstones with the past that help us in the present to create identity, who we are, where we came from, and that helps to serve, and to a certain extent, as a roadmap to where we're going. Now, with respect to hunter-gatherer societies and the construction of mortuary monuments, memory within a ritual context is very important. And ritual is good for perpetuating memory. And it does it in several ways. One, as an example, the Catholic liturgy. Structured, almost timeless. It repeats. There's a series of events that occur during Mass, and it almost seems timeless. It's predictable. And Other rituals in small-scale societies, not quite like the Catholic liturgy. It's not written down, it's not formalized, but people remember, and they perform things in a certain order. So that structure, that repetition, helps archaeologically to see things that perhaps are ritually related. And again, this whole process of remembering and creating memories and identity helps provide people with, as I put it up here, a cognitive map of who they are, and allows them to situate themselves within a social world, the community, the larger community, and even the greater world out and about around us. So now we get to Thornhill Lake. It's located pretty much right across the river from Sanford on the St. Johns River. It's kind of a backwater slough of the main channel of the St. Johns. It's a little lake, and it's a pretty neat place. Currently, it's a conservation area, the Lake Monroe Conservation Area, so it's protected, it's preserved. Although, to be honest, if you really wanted to loot the site, you could get there pretty easy from the water, but you have to know where the mounds are. Funny anecdote, it took me 3 tries to find the mounds at this site. I finally had to have an airboat captain who'd been going there for 25 years show me where it was. Funniest thing, he didn't know there were 2 mounds. He knew there was 1. But among the first folks to get to Thornhill Lake, our old buddy Clarence Moore. I don't know of a whole lot of important sites in the St. Johns that he didn't get to first. Here's young Clarence at his Harvard graduation photo, looking very dapper and handsome. A man about town in Philadelphia. An excellent photographer. Unfortunately, a freak tennis accident took the vision, I think, in his left eye. He was very sensitive to light. But he did take a picture of Thornhill Lake. It's one of the very few sites he did photograph. And here we have, I believe this is Mound A. And you might notice that there's a little bit of a little shell divot there in the top center of the mound. Apparently, before Moore got there, there were other folks poking around, digging into the mound, although he describes it as superficial. And compared to what he did, indeed, it is superficial. All right, so as part of my research program, I created a topographic map of Thornhill Lake. To my knowledge, it is the only topographic map of an archaic mortuary mound complex in Florida, at least in the St. Johns River Valley. Clarence Moore, in his original field notes, describes the site as being 2 mounds oriented north-south from one another, with 2 parallel ridges running north from the northernmost mound. Does anybody see the problem with his description and what it actually looks like? One of the things that I discovered while creating the map of the site is that Clarence consistently confuses northwest with north. He talks about putting a trench up the north side of Mound A. Well, it's kind of on the northwest side. And he talks about the parallel ridges running north from Mound B. Well, it's kind of northwest. But we won't fault him. He was probably sitting on the deck of the Gopher drinking mint juleps anyway. He had his hired help and his traveling companion, Milo Miller, to do most of the work for him. But Clarence does say that there are, in fact, ridges and eminences across the site in addition to the 2 mounds. The main topographic features are obviously mounds A and B. Did I skip past one of these pictures? Did it move on me? I didn't even notice because they're so close. Anyway, Mound A, largest mound. As we'll see, it is also the latest mound. Mound B, slightly smaller. We have a ramp running up the northwest side of Mound B, connecting to the north ridge. The south ridge is actually kind of oriented southwest. The thing known as the shell mining pit used to be a big shell mound, but the drag lines got to it. It was close enough to the water so you could actually haul the shell out and load it onto the barge. And when we had those really, really bad hurricanes back in 2004, the water in Thornhill Lake was so high, I had to go out there and see what was going on. Only thing left above water was about 6 inches of the apron around the west shell knoll, and you can see the drag line slot right through the edge of the mound going out into the lake. Looked like a keyhole, kind of. But down there to the southeast of the west shell knoll, you have the east shell knoll, and it too was mined for shell commercially. But the mounds, apparently too much sand, not enough shell, or too far from the water, so they escaped the ravages of 20th century shell mining. Now, because I'm interested in the structure, the internal structure of the mounds and the ridges, I targeted the topographic features for my excavations. Most of them terminated prematurely due to the presence of disarticulated human remains. And in discussions with the state archaeologist and the human remains coordinator, we decided it was best to just stop and move on to other places. So I did, but I did, even though some of my excavations did stop short, I did get good stratigraphic information and, in a few cases, a number of radiocarbon dates. But as you can see, I hit literally all the high points of the site, as well as a couple of low areas as well, just to act as a control for what was going on in the mounds. So, brief word about monuments and memory. Again, memory operates on several levels with respect to the monuments at Thornhill Lake. One, the places chosen to build the sand mortuary mounds are the same places that early on in Mount Taylor period folks chose to mound shell. So there's a sort of piggybacking on mounding behaviors. The other is that the deposits themselves are pretty regular and structured, which, if you'll recall back to memory and the performance of rituals being cyclical and repeated and structured, I believe I have some good evidence for that. Now, not all structured deposits that are consistently layered are creations through ritual practice. I would argue that mortuary mounds provide an exception. But first, site formation. Now, the earliest radiocarbon dates that I have and all the subsurface testing that I've done found that essentially this site started at about 6,300 calendar years before present as a sort of comma or crescent-shaped shell ridge. And I was able to put at least 2 test units that went from top to bottom all the way through the deposits at the site. In some other places, it was just too deep to feasibly dig because of the water table, and a 2-meter deep 1x1 is a dangerous place to be. So we stopped short in most cases. But 2 of them were able to penetrate the entire deposits, and I have basal dates for those. Now, about 59 to 5,500 years ago, they start to mound things up. You'll notice that Mound B is constructed. It is the older of the 2 mounds. It is also the smallest. At about this time also, the South Ridge is built, and the 2 shell nodes on the North Ridge are also constructed. Now flash forward to 5,200 to 4,800 years, Cal BP, and you have the 2 westernmost shell deposits accumulating at the site. And lastly, between 48 and 4,500 Cal BP, you have Mound A, the big mound down at the south end, and a tiny little shell knoll that I never knew was there until I decided to put some radials for my, my topographic mapping out in that area. I mean, literally, this site, I'm almost ashamed to admit it, I got lost there once. It is so thick with palmettos and juvenile cabbage palms that you can't see more than about 8 feet in front of you in any direction. And if you don't have a compass, it's very easy to get disoriented. But this little mound was off hiding in the woods over there. I put it at the tail end because I don't have any radiocarbon dates for it, so I can't say it came before, but it certainly was, it could have been towards the end. The important thing here is that through excavation, I found that, again, the shell mounds prior to the mortuary mounds were the locations at which people chose to create the burial mounds. Now, I talked about structured deposits in the mounds, and Clarence Moore describes them pretty well, and I found them in excavation. Now, when Moore put his test units, his quote-unquote test units, his trenches, his pits, into Mound B, he found what he called undifferentiated brown sand. Well, he didn't have a Munsell book, and there are differences in the colors of the sand. But I don't have the descriptions here, but essentially layers 5 and 6, layer 6 is shell. 1 through 5 are all sand. 1 is pretty disturbed. 2 through 5 are relatively undisturbed, bioturbative processes notwithstanding. But fortunately, at the base of this, I got a good radiocarbon date from some charcoal. But what you do find, rather than just being a homogeneous, undifferentiated mass of sand in which burials with all kinds of exotic goodies were placed, there's actually some stratigraphic differentiation here. Now, this is sort of a prelude. It demonstrates that the stratification, the layering, the consistent repetition in mounding episodes exists. But Mound A is the clearest of the cases. Now, I didn't get to put a whopping big trench up the middle of Mound A like Clarence Moore did, but fortunately, he was able to describe it for me in his field notes and in his publications. But what you have in Mound A, it contrasts markedly with Mound B. Remember, Mound A is later. It's considerably later. But you have this white sand phenomenon. And among the St. Johns River mortuary facilities from Harris Creek to Orange Mound to Persimmon Baxter and the DeLeon Springs Mound, you have these alternating layers of white sand. Less so at Harris Creek, but the white sand is associated with the mortuary facilities there. But in Mound A, you have white sand with burials, and then brown sand, and then white sand again with more brown sand there at the top. These are pretty good evidence of intentional mounding behavior, but also repeated behaviors. It was structured deposits. Now, this white sand doesn't occur naturally at Thornhill Lake. I know, I've dug shovel tests all around it. This came from the pine flatwoods about a half a kilometer away. So folks were actually having to transport this large quantities of sand from further afield to the site itself. Otherwise, the sand is gray or brown from my testing there. And now an interesting thing that I found is when I put a test unit in the South Ridge, I found pretty good evidence of mounding of the shell, and that it occurs in sort of a burst right around 3960 to 3530 BC. And at the base of these superimposed sort of mounded shell and sand deposits, I found a hearth that had a partially carbonized log laying along the edge of it. And I submitted that for the date. But here you have what appears to be in strata 3 through 5 mounded shell and sand, which was capped by a very homogeneous and undifferentiated gray sand and shell. It was a capping event which served to raise the level of the ridge and expand it out. So all that had to happen after 4950 plus or minus 90 and before fiber tempered pottery about 4500 BC. For BP. Now, mounds are material culture. Monuments are material culture, but artifacts too can evoke memories in a ritual context. And I talked about my record and how that transported me magically back to 1994. Artifacts can do the same thing. Other items of material culture can do the same. Think about a family photo album. You have multiple generations represented in a photo album with many, many memories being evoked through the process of just leafing through it. Good or bad. Now, the way this works is things act as signs or indices of past events, people, places, times even. Imagine walking on the beach and you see say somebody was riding a horse across the beach. I don't know why, but there's hoof prints on the beach. Now, you see the hoof prints, and you know that a horse was there. But how do you really know? Because in your common experience, you know that a horse has hooves, and they leave prints. Now, the hoof doesn't look like the horse, but you know that it stands for the horse. It's representative of the horse. That's kind of how material items can work as indices of these past events, people, and places. And their inclusion in mortuary contexts, by extension, includes other people and ostensibly other places as well, in addition to the social relationships that underwrote or were facilitated by these materials. So here's some of the stuff Clarence Moore got from Thornhill Lake. A lot of these materials are clearly not from here. The jasper beads probably came from Mississippi. There was a well-developed lapidary industry in Mississippi during the Archaic period. Now, the perforated shark's teeth and the shell rings and the shell beads totally could have been from Florida. Either coast, not sure. Same thing for the mass of shell beads found with one of the burials. I haven't talked about this fellow. Milo Miller identified him as a male. Now, there may have been a little gender bias back in the 19th century, perhaps, but I think Milo Miller might have known a little bit of skeletal biology. Nevertheless, one individual in Mound A was accompanied by that mass of beads. strung out on his chest, wrapped around his wrists. Those two little banner stones were each at his wrist, like a little bracelet, a little charm, if you will. The banner stone in the top center on his chest with the beads. All the, well, I shouldn't say all, but many of the red jasper beads also on his chest, interspersed with the tubular shell beads and the smaller shell beads, some of which are made from freshwater mussel. I wasn't aware that folks were making freshwater mussel shell beads in the Archaic period, but apparently they were. I thought most of them would have been marine shell, and indeed most of them are. Now, let's see. The three banner stones on the bottom were found with three individuals in the center of Mound B, the smaller mound. Two of them are a limestone, a hard limestone, not found in Florida. It is not one of our natural formations. The other is made from soapstone. And all of these probably originated along the Savannah River Valley at the Georgia-South Carolina border. There are well-known production sites for banner stones in this area of these materials. Oh, and one of the, I think the pendant on the right, top right, was also with the gentleman with all the beads and banner stones. I think I described him as being festooned with all of the riches of the Northlands at one point. Now, those are pretty spectacular things to find in an Archaic period mound in Florida. These others, not so much. Pretty common, pretty mundane. Overall, not really impressive unless you consider the fact that the top center specimen B was found in a bucket auger, fortuitously augured right down on top of it without breaking. The rest of them, pretty well interspersed within the shell deposits across the site. Now, even though these are just pretty plain, kind of commonplace artifacts, they still have the potential to evoke memories and commemoration. And although they may not have operated within a ritual context, in the domestic sphere, memory was at work as well. Just as an example, I'm a flint knapper, and I can go into my backyard in the piles and piles of chert and coral and pull out a piece and tell you where I found it and when I got it. I suspect that prehistoric folks also knew where the rocks they were using came from or who they came from, and could tell you similar biographical information about the objects that they have. Now, some of the best evidence for some of these materials being exchange items brought to and from the St. Johns River Valley through exchange networks is the fact that at Thornhill Lake, over 50% of the bifaces are made from silicified coral. No big deal. You know, lots of coral was being made, stone tools were being made and moved all about Florida. The interesting thing is, in all my excavations at Thornhill Lake, the debitage is less than 6% coral. The rest of it's chert. Why such an imbalance? Coral tools are probably coming in as finished items. The ones made from chert were coming in as probably larger material packages. And I'll talk a little bit more about that right here. Here I have the relative frequency of various material types by quarry cluster coming from Thornhill Lake. The upper Withlacoochee quarry cluster, the chert and coral from there, are by and far the most dominant material, followed by chert from the Hillsborough River area. Brooksville, a little bit. Lake Pennsauken area, a little bit too. You know, you would think that most of it would come from there since it's closest. It completely bypassed the Ocala quarry cluster. Don't know why. But Gainesville is represented by two Noonan points made of chert. And debitage from the Gainesville quarry cluster numbered 3 flakes. In any event, all these materials had to come from someplace else. There's no rock in the St. Johns. People were moving them to and fro. And this is important because apparently there were connections, either directly or through down the line exchange with your neighbors, maybe family members, connecting people at Thornhill Lake to the broader community in West Florida. Now, I have a bunch of organic tools too, and not just tools, but also some interesting items. The bone tools and pins, pretty commonplace, no big deal. There's a bunch of them in the St. Johns River Valley. Now, what was interesting is item H. That I have interpreted as an ear spool, and it's made of all things from a dolphin vertebra that has been had all the projections ground off of it. Good grief. And a circumferential groove cut in it. Now, I have been cautioned that I maybe should not call that an ear spool, but it looks an awful lot like an ear spool. I'll I'll ponder that for a while. Down at the bottom, I have L and M. Those are bone beads. And interestingly, at the site, items made from organic media that find parallels in the inorganic foreign media, this exotic stone from Mississippi and Georgia and South Carolina, are mirrored in natural organic substances. Specimen E over there on the far right is a shell pendant that looks very similar to the stone ones made from the wings of broken banner stones. And of course the shell beads over there, and both of those, E, F, and G, all of those were found in between Mounds A and B on the central part of the ridge that was formed the initial part of the site. So we have the western coast of Florida areas represented by lots of stone, perhaps shell as well. Really can't tell where the shell comes from. Could be east coast, could be west. Same thing with the shark's teeth. But it looks like, as we will see in the next slide, people at Thornhill Lake were getting stuff from a lot of different places. Clearly the most obvious are the ones from further afield, the exotic stone, but also the southeast coast of Florida. Tampa Bay area with chert and possibly shell. And I should mention that the southeast coast of Florida is the queen conch. We have tools made from the lips of the queen conch, which doesn't have range much up past the southeast coast of Florida. But there's also Buzicon carica, the knobbed whelk from the Atlantic coast, chert from several areas. So it looks like Thornhill Lake, to some extent, was plugged into the greater Archaic period community between 6,300 and 4,500 cal BP. So Thornhill Lake, hunter-gatherers, monuments, and memory. Now, the way I've interpreted this site is that the mounds and the construction of the mounds reference earlier practices, where people chose to make shell mounds. Whether or not they had a ritual function or not was the same location that they chose to put the mortuary mounds. And I think you'd be hard-pressed to find any society that doesn't have some concern for the dead ancestors. And the construction of these mounds occurred in a ritualized fashion. It was a ritual event. Now, there are aspects of mortuary ritual that leave no tangible traces at all. Oratory, people giving speeches, for lack of a better word, about the deceased. No visible traces. Gestures performed by individuals. Dancing. None of that shows up. There's no traces of it. However, the practices that we do have are the repetitive construction episodes of the mounds. And you can see repeated episodes of monumental architecture being created within a ritual context by first grafting the mounds onto previous locations that had possibly some significance. Maybe they just wanted to have a little higher area to build their mound on. Fine. But then you start laying down sand, some of which comes from a half a kilometer away. That's a long distance to carry a lot of basketfuls of sand. And then you have people put in there. And then more sediments. And then more people. And then more sediments. They're building up this mortuary structure over time. And each time you engage with that mound, with that monument, you're also engaging with the past, with what came before in the initial siting of the mound at the old shell mounds, as well as the continued use and reuse of the same location for more people. Now, in the mounds, you have people, literally people. Probably some of them were local, some of them may have been further afield. Recent isotopic studies by a colleague of mine at UF found that at least 2 individuals buried at Harris Creek came from really far away, based on the oxygen isotopes in their teeth. They grew up, one, in the Tennessee-Virginia area, pretty far away. That's a long ways from the St. Johns River Valley. Now, the other individual came, perhaps, speculation, at least from Lake Okeechobee south. The proportion of oxygen isotopes in the teeth would suggest that it could have been north of Cuba and south of Lake Okeechobee. That's pretty far south from Thornhill Lake. So it looks like people clearly were moving around in the past. They found their way from faraway places to Florida, just like artifacts found their way from faraway places to Florida. Now, you have these individuals, perhaps, buried at Thornhill Lake, but certainly they're things, the items from far away, carrying with them their own biography, their histories. If you are a student of anthropology, maybe you've heard of Bronislaw Malinowski and the Kula-ring, the shell items that are exchanged clockwise and counterclockwise cyclically. Those things gather biographies. They're important because of who owned them. And prestige comes from giving them away, parting with such valuable things. And I'm not saying that's what was happening at Thornhill Lake, but at the very least, you have things that may have had biographies. You know, it's like buying memorabilia from, I don't know, what do they call them? Celebrities. Sort of like having something cool that somebody you knew or know of owned before. But it brings those histories into this one spot, this context of the mound. So the mounds very literally incorporate people in the form of bodies, people with things, artifacts, standing as proxies for them, and by incorporating all these different elements as well as the repeated activities that occur at the site, you have these monuments being constructed that, to a very literal extent, incorporate other people, other places, and possibly even other times into this one locality. So here you have the wider social network of Thornhill Lake people writ small in the site. And to a certain extent, I think these folks were incorporating other people and other places into their own individual narratives, their own stories of who they were and who they are, which, if you recall, I mentioned earlier, gives people a sense of course, where they're from, but also where they're going. And that's, I believe, the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your time. I really do appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Anybody have any questions? Yes, I know that because there's no debris from their manufacture at the site or the immediate area around it, at least not much. 2% of the 1,000+ chert flakes I found were coral, and over half of the stone tools were coral. That's a pretty big disparity. Now, at the Lake Monroe Outlet Midden that Janus and ACI excavated back in 2001, 2000, it was something to the order of 35% of the bifaces were coral, and 51% of the debitage was coral. That's, you know, pretty on par, but there were also at Thornhill Lake no manufacture failures, no points that broke during use. These were all old, worn out, well resharpened tools. Good question. I did a survey of the 8,000 acres in which Thornhill Lake is contained, and I found 2 lithic scatters, 1 bone midden, and 2 other shell middens that are all Orange period or later. I found 1 site that had a Mount Taylor component, and it was relatively close, but it was a bone-only midden. So there's not a whole lot of habitation going on close by in the conservation area, but a little bit to the south there was Lemon Bluff, and Lemon Bluff had an archaic component. So it's possible folks could have been living there, sites further up the river, inland even. But at Thornhill Lake, the evidence I have, the zooarchaeology is being worked out now. I have a colleague who's doing that for his master's thesis, and he's telling me there's some weird stuff going on there with respect to the kinds of, the distribution of different faunal species as well as the quantities. Apparently there's dogs and bears and pumas and things going on in addition to all the fish and turtles that are atypical for a site of its size. But folks clearly were living there. There's pit features. There's hearths. There's obviously food remains. So whether or not they were there all the time or just there sometimes associated with mortuary rituals, still kind of working that out myself. All right, here's what I can tell from Clarence Moore's field notes and his publications. The burial in Mound A that had all the really neat stuff, the little miniature banner stones, and the banner stone pendant, and the banner stone on his chest, all the beads, he was laid on his back, hands upon the abdomen, beads heaped, quote unquote, on his chest. Some of the jasper beads were in there, so the shelled rings. The shark tooth pendant was part of his assemblage on his chest. And then the beads were wrapped, he says, from wrist to forearm or elbow along his forearm. And he said the banner stones are on his wrist, the little ones. So it could have been on the outside, it could have been on the inside. I'm not sure. I would love to have an artistic rendering of what that would have looked like. I think that'd make a neat graphic, but I'm not an artist.
But the hands were here.
Hands were sort of here. So he had his chest heaped with beads, hands slightly below, with perhaps the banner stones on the outside. He doesn't really specify in his field notes. The other burials also were found in that similar fashion in Mound B. The ones with the banner stones they were also on the chest.
And was the shark's tooth on top of the banner stone?
Never says. We don't know. Again, Clarence Moore, love him or hate him. His methods, 19th century. His note-taking, ahead of the time, but still not quite up to modern standards. But what can you do? You got to do the best you can with what he gives you. The majority of the burials, and I've actually figured this out, there were 54 burials between both mounds. Most of them were in Mound A. There were 7 in Mound B that he found, but the balance was in Mound A. Now, about 10% of the population had cool stuff. They had banner stones or jasper beads or shell beads. Now, there were a lot of people who had absolutely nothing at all in the mound as well. So, I'm sorry, but getting back to your question about flexed, there were 2 flexed burials. The rest of them were extended burials on their backs. So probably relatively shortly after death, they were interred. They weren't hanging out in a charnel house being tightly flexed in a little bundle for later burial. Well, I reckon that's all then. Thank you.